Pnawn da I chi gyd. Good afternoon. Diolch am bod yn amyneddgar. It's a great pleasure for me. Mae'n bleser I fi yn bersonol I groesawu chi i'r ddarlith yma. It's a great pleasure for me as Vice Chancellor of Bangor University to welcome you to this joint event. Gweithredoedd fan hyn ar y cyd, gweithred ar y cyd rhwng y Brifysgol a'r Gymdeithas Ddysgedig Cymru for this joint event by Bangor University and the Learned Society of Wales. Bydde wedi bod yn braf i'ch groesawu chi gyd yma I Bangor. It would have been great for this event to have occurred in Bangor. But I'm extremely pleased that we are able to proceed with this event online. Mae popeth nawr yn digidol. We are all digital now, which is a good thing, and it's a great thing also, especially to welcome our guests from Ireland. At the same time, I'd like to welcome guests from all the organisations which are represented here today, from government bodies, from policymakers in both Wales and Ireland, for health bodies, and also from representatives from the Welsh Government. Croeso cynnes iawn I chi gyd i'r digwyddiad yma. Cynhadaeth y Gymdeithas Ddysgedig, wrth gwrs, yw sicrhau bod ni'n rhagorol a bod ni'n ymwneud â rhagoriaeth. Part of the mission of the Learned Society is to promote excellence and scholarship, to inspire learning for the benefit of the world and for the benefit of the nation. Fi'n hynod o browd o'r ffaith bod yma ym Mhrifysgol Bangor, mae yna siwr gymaint o'n gyfeillion hi yn rhan o'r Gymdeithas Ddysgedig. It's a great pleasure for me to note that a number of my colleagues are fellows of the Learned Society, and I also am proud to be part of this group. Hoffwn ddweud gair neu ddau yn gyntaf am digwyddiadau'r prynhawn yma. Before introducing our two distinguished guests, I'd like to give some housekeeping details to you. You'll be able to propose a question in English or Welsh by tapping on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote a question proposed by another member of the audience. We will, during the course of the interview, be monitoring questions which will take place, and I will put a selection of these questions before the speakers in due course. I will not be able to obviously ask all of the questions on your behalf, but I hope to be able to capture the main themes of the questions in the question and answer session, which both speakers have agreed to partake in. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child came into force in the UK in 1992, and it is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in the world. It aims to protect and promote the rights of all children around the world. It's widely accepted that in the context of the most stressful situations, the evidence is clear that children are often the most affected in stressful and other situations. So the rights of the child, whatever their ethnicity, whatever gender, religion, language, abilities, or any other status, are so critical in the context of the world order and how things should and need to be. One of the great elements of my own professional career, for which I am most proud, is being the head of a law school, which, working with the Welsh Government, was able to ensure that in Welsh law, the rights of the children and young persons are encapsulated in the whole approach of the Welsh Government in settling legislation. Welsh ministers have to have or pay due regard to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in legislation and policy. And very much like other things that Wales can pioneer in, the issue of legislative approach and the question of wider rights issues, whether it is on the basis of sustainability, to language, to the rights of the child, is something that I am very proud of, and a part of that process of ensuring that Wales and Welsh law in particular is at the forefront of progressive movements in the world. A word of introduction in terms of Professor Mary McAleese. She was, of course, born into a Catholic family in Belfast. Her family experienced at first hand the sectarian violence which blighted Northern Ireland for decades. As a consequence, she became deeply involved in anti-sectarianism and inter-religious reconciliation. She's a member of the bar, she's a broadcaster, she is an academic lawyer qualified in both civil law and also Catholic Church canon law. Whilst in her 20s, she was appointed Reid Professor of Law at Trinity, Dublin, and she later became Director of the Institute of Professional Legal Studies at the Queen's University of Belfast. She was the first female Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Queen's University Belfast and is currently Professor of Children, Religion and Law at the University of Glasgow. She is Chancellor of Trinity College, Dublin. But most of you will know Mary as the former President of Ireland, a post she held with distinction from 1997 to 2011. She was the first person from Northern Ireland to hold that role and was re-elected unopposed to serve a second term. The theme of her presidency, which I think is pertinent for the age in which we currently involve ourselves in, is that of building bridges. And throughout her years in office, she worked to heal the fractured relationships on the island of Ireland and became the first president to invite and host Her Majesty the Queen on the first state visit to the Irish Republic by a British monarch. We are proud that Mary is a Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales. She's also, of course, Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and also the Royal Irish Academy, and a member of the Council of Women World Leaders. Mae'n hyfrydwch hefyd I groesawu Sally Holland. Sally became the third Children's Commissioner for Wales in April 2015. She's a registered social worker with experience in the statutory and voluntary sectors. Sally, prior to taking up the post of Children's Commissioner, she was Professor in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University, where she founded and became Director of the Cascade Children's Social Care Research and Development Centre. During Sally's time as Commissioner, Wales has established a youth parliament, removed the legal defence for common assault, smacking of young people or children, and gave more funding and support to young people leaving care. Sally and her team published 2 reports on bullying, resulting in stronger statutory guidance for school. The team is currently working to influence government policy on tackling children poverty, providing more mental health support for children, and ensuring that all children learn about and also experience their human rights in the education system. Felly, gyfeillion, mae'n bleser o'r mwyaf I fi I groesawu a ddwy siaradwr heno. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me formally to welcome on your behalf the 2 speakers for this afternoon's dialogue. Croeso I chi gyd.
Diolch yn fawr, Iwan, a diolch yn fawr am y croeso gynnes. Dwi'n hapus iawn I fod yma gyda chi gyd y prynhawn ma, a dwi'n hapus iawn I gael y cyfle I gael sgwrs gyda Mary, y prynhawn ma. I'm so delighted really to have had the invitation to speak with Mary this afternoon. We had a pre-meet last week, and having had the chance to chew the fat a bit over children's rights issues, I can tell you all now that you're in for a treat. in listening to Mary's experience and very lively opinions about children's rights. I certainly am really looking forward to hearing more from her this afternoon. So, Mary, I think we're going to begin now. We've got about 35 or 40 minutes to chat about your experience and your thoughts before we open up to questions, which I suspect will start to come flooding in as we start talking. And what I think I'd like to do is start about now, and then later on we'll look a bit back earlier on in your career and how you think things have changed for children. But most recently, you've been doing some really important work in thinking in an academic way, really, about children's rights in relation to the Catholic Church. And you've done that doctorate in recent years, which I believe you defended in public, as you do in Italy, in Italian, which, you know, is hugely, I'm full of admiration for. It's a scary enough thing defending a PhD in private in your first language. But what I'd really like you to do is, bearing in mind we've got a very large and very mixed audience this evening, tell us a bit in sort of everyday language what you found out in your doctorate and what you think are the most important messages from that.
Thank you very much, Sally. Prinhanda. It's good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. A big thank you to the Learned Society of Wales for having me as a member, and also, of course, to the university. Good to have the Vice-Chancellor here for hosting this. It's a marvellous opportunity, and great to get to know you also, Sally, and the work that you're doing, this great work that Wales is doing on behalf of children. So I left, I'm a civil lawyer by profession. I started off my life as a barrister and then became an academic lawyer. And then when I was planning to leave office in 2011 as president, I planned that I would revert back to where I had started my academic career, which was actually in looking at children. My first piece of research ever as a young academic was looking at children in custody. So I decided I'd go back and I would look at children in the canon law of the Catholic Church, because over the years, as I have studied canon law, one of the things that always confounded me in a way was how we overlook the long shelf life of attitudes, perceptions, beliefs, and structures that have come to us through very, very old, antique faith systems. Catholic Church, 2,000 years old, arguably, Judaism, Islam, all very, very old and very powerful systems still. And we tend, I think, to overlook the power that is exercised even today, the long shelf life of ideas that are still carried through those systems from generation to generation, century to century. And nowhere is that more obvious than it is in relation to children. It's also very obvious in relation to women, but it's very obvious in relation to children. So I decided that I would make the rest of my life, if you like, it would be about studying where children fit in the canon law of the Catholic Church. Why would that even be important to anybody who isn't Catholic? Well, honestly, anybody who lives in a common law system will not have been told, even in law school possibly, that before we had the common law, we had canon law. And before that, we had Roman law and we had Judaic law. And these formed a meld that carried with them attitudes straight into the common law that we have today. And that's so obvious in relation to children, the relationship between parents and children. Structure, it's an architecture, it has a structure, and it's still very powerful today. So I decided that that's what I was going to study. And really, in order to understand, mainly when I look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think some of us missed the point in some ways, that what the committee and the committee is trying to do in its work in monitoring the convention is trying to push us, nation after nation, nearly 200 nations now, to dismantle the parts of that architecture of childhood and childhood relationships, which are getting in the way of children blossoming fully with all their fundamental freedoms intact. And so I went to a very important source. Why did I go to the Catholic Church? Well, I'm a member of the Catholic Church, first of all, so it was a good place to start. But it's more than that. The Holy See, unlike every other faith system in the world, is a state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's the only faith system that is. The other 190 odd state parties are nations, like it's the United Kingdom, it's Ireland, it's Greece, it's Spain, it's everywhere except the United States, of course. It's the only country in the United Nations not to have signed up. So I looked at that. I decided to go there because I would have expected that, like all state parties which have ratified the convention are obliged to take the convention very seriously. And they're supposed to take their laws and their administrative practices and match them against the convention and see where are they lacking, where do they need to reform, where do they need to update. So I thought, well, let me look and see, since the Catholic Church, the Holy See, was one of the first state parties. It was the fourth state party to ratify the convention. So there was great enthusiasm for it back in 1990 in the Catholic Church. Well, I wanted to see, well, what has it done with canon law? Because it has a universal system of law, affects 1.2 billion people worldwide. 1 in 6 people in the world is governed by the Catholic Church's Code of Canon Law, and there are somewhere between 300 and 400 million children who are members of the Church who are covered by that canon law. So I thought, well, why don't I then study and see what the Church has done with canon law to bring it into, to apply the principles of the convention. And that's really where the problem started, because
what did you find?
They haven't done very much. And not only have they not done very much, they now take the view, very regrettably. The Committee on the Rights of the Child, in case anybody who's listening doesn't really know what the committee does, the committee is a monitoring body which, on behalf of the United Nations, monitors all the state parties to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. On a regular basis, it asks them, what have you done? You know, how are you getting on with the convention? How are you applying it? And every so often, it'll say, well, you've done very well there, but it might also say, really, you need to do more here. Corporal Punishment's a classic example of one of the big success stories where it has nudged and pushed the agenda on corporal punishment of children. But what it said to the Holy See was, you need to take the code of canon law and reform it in the light of the convention, because it's not meeting the needs of children. More importantly, it's not meeting the rights of children. And the Church has responded, the Holy See has responded by saying it absolutely refuses to accept that it has to reform canon law in order as a state party. And it uses. So
Mary, what does that mean for children? What impact does that have on children?
Here's a very simple one, Sally. It's a very profound one, but it's very simple. 84% of all members of the Catholic Church became members on the day they were baptized as babies. And because the Catholic Church, the canon law says to parents, Catholic parents, you must get your baby baptized at the earliest opportunity. The minute you are baptized, two things happen, or two sets of things happen. One is kind of rather nice. It's the grace of baptism and the gift of baptism and all that beautiful stuff. Anybody who believes in original sin, it gets rid of original sin. It opens up the door of salvation. These are lovely things, but they are a gift. They are gratuitous. Then there's the hard stuff, which I call the legal stuff. And that legal stuff says, now, you as a baby, and there you are, you're in the church, your parents are hoping that you won't waken and cry. They're about to pour the water over your head. You haven't a clue what's going on. And suddenly now you are a member for life of the Catholic Church. And you are a member with rights, that many, and obligations, that many. And those obligations start to kick in from the age of 7, you know, when you must confess your sins, when you engage in the sacraments. Most importantly, those obligations oblige you to be obedient to the teaching magisterium of the church. In other words, whatever the bishops tell you they are teaching, you're obliged to be obedient. Now, just think about that for a moment. That means that at baptism, by baptism, that child's right to freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of belief, even freedom of religion are compromised from the beginning. And the church has never, ever engaged with that reality. So here we have two realities running in parallel, one of which is the child's human rights and also adult human rights as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're all free human beings. We're free to make our own minds up, to have our own opinions, to have our own beliefs, to change religion if we want to walk away from religion if we want to, you know, free and untrammeled. And here is the Code of Canon Law saying, actually, no, you're a member for life and you're obliged to be obedient. And indeed, there may very well be penalties in certain circumstances if you are not obedient. You know, if you deny certain teaching of the church, you know, we still have the old, well, they're not even old, they are still current in the Catholic Church, ideas, you know, on schism and heresy and apostasy. And these are regarded as offenses within the church. So the church has never integrated human rights, and in particular the rights of the child, to which it subscribes, and subscribed voluntarily. Nobody forced the Holy See to become a state party, but it did. So that's for I researched that. I was horrified, Sally, I mean really horrified, that an organization with between 300 and 400 million children had not done this work before. There was nothing. It really was a blank page. And regrettably, since I started this work, unfortunately, the Holy See has now stated quite plainly that it does not intend to accept that it has any responsibility to change the universal law of the Catholic Church, to bring it into line with the Convention. And it has come up with this remarkable excuse, which thankfully the Committee on the Rights of the Child has not fallen for. It suddenly discovered, 25 years after joining, it said that actually they believe that the Convention is only applicable to an actual geographic territory. And it only has a tiny geographic territory, which is the Vatican City State. That's about the size of a golf course. And for most of the time that it was reporting to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it barely mentioned the Vatican City State. Why? Because there were no children, they said, in Vatican City State, so it didn't apply. Then all of a sudden, about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more actually, 7 or 8 years ago, it was discovered that there were children. Now, they hadn't been hidden, I don't think, but they're discovered that there were children in Vatican City State. You might remember the famous Paolo Gabrielli affair. And Paolo Gabrielli was Pope Benedict's, he was his butler, a layman who had stolen documents, if you remember. Anyway, so in the telling of the story, suddenly it turned out that he had 3 or 4 children. They were all living in Vatican City State. And a few of us went, what? Wait, what? There are children? And so did the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And so suddenly the Vatican City State law was changed, amended a little bit to so-called bring it into line with the Convention. And suddenly the reports from the Holy See to the Committee on the Rights of the Child started to say, well, we acknowledge we ratified on behalf of 2 parties. One was the tiny little state, where of course the Convention is applicable because it's got a territory, and the other is the 1.2 billion Catholics that the Holy See represents. But no, we didn't ratify. We ratified on behalf of the Holy See, but we're not obliged to implement the Convention for them, which strikes me as just beyond ludicrous. Luckily for me, the Committee on the Rights of the Child also think it's ludicrous and more or less said to the Holy See, no, we don't buy that, and we're not going to put that argument. So there's a bit of a standoff there at the moment.
Oh, that's interesting.
The important thing, Sally, that I'm trying to, where my work is bringing me to is saying, look, very often the most important civil rights and human rights that are set out, the novelty, the innovative in the convention are really the rights of the child to freedom of expression, religion, belief, conscience, because these are about the child as a world citizen, you know, with autonomous rights, not rights under the wing of your parents or your pastor, but this is where you, as a young adolescent moving towards adulthood, start to express yourself freely. And this, of course, is precisely, you've experienced this very recently in Wales. This is where religious organizations immediately have us stand up and say, oh, you're treading now on our freedom of religion. You cannot go there. And the answer quite properly to that is, yes, you do have freedom of religion, absolutely. And as parents, you have the right to baptize your child, to raise them in your faith, to give them the faith formation. But your rights and your parenting rights and obligations have to be directed in a way that also takes account of the child's right to blossom in his or her freedoms. So part of what you have to do is to prepare your child for the day that child may very well say, look, Mum, I really don't buy this religion that you brought me up in. I mean, I really appreciate all the good things, but no, I'm just finished with that. And you have to be able to let them go, because that's their right.
Yes, and you know, we have been debating this in Wales in all sorts of ways. And just last week, I was giving evidence to our cross-party committee about our new curriculum bill, including a new provision within that, which will mean that all children should learn about all faiths, values and ethics as part of their curriculum. But there's a potential get-out clause for some of the faiths, for parents in some of the faith schools, to say they don't want their children to have that broad religious education, which I feel is in direct contravention of the rights of the convention. I think that, you know, faith schools should be allowed to carry on with their values and ethics and their collective worship, etc. But what they learn in the classroom about religion should be as broad-based, no matter as can be, no matter which school a child happens to be sent to by their parents. So you're right, this is a sort of ongoing debate, the freedom of belief and religion.
I think we probably didn't really realize when the convention was promulgated in 1989 that we were really up against these long shelf life attitudes, and that freedom of religion was going to get in the way of children's freedoms. In this particular way. It doesn't need to, in my view, it doesn't need to get in the way of it, but those who argue for freedom of religion have to understand that in and of itself, it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't answer the question for a faith school to say, we're entitled to teach our children our own religion. And my answer is, of course you are, by all means, of course you are. But you also have to understand this child also has rights. And you have to, as that parent, as that guardian, as that teacher, you have to honor those rights. And among those rights are the child's freedom of expression. To have freedom of expression, you have to have freedom of information. You have to know about the world you live in. And part and parcel of that information will be information about other faith systems, about agnosticism, about atheism, about science, about other ways. And you cannot, in the interests of your own religious freedom, trammel on the freedom of that child to have access to other information that will help him or her in adolescence to begin to grow into the fine kind of adult who is able to weigh things, who's able, who's not frightened of information, who's not scared or kept in a bunker, as I was as a child. And many of us in Northern Ireland on both sides, we grew up in these ridiculous bunkers, but where we were, in those days, I mean, even the Catholic Church decided what you could read and what you couldn't read, and what was, all of this kind of silly nonsense that we now look at, and are appalled by. But we have moved, and I think in dialogue with parents now, I think the vast majority of parents, particularly of adolescents, they turn on the television, the information is there. They turn on the internet, the information is there. They have platforms that can take them right around the world. To try and hold them back to put them in a bunker, to put them in, you know, to keep them cocooned from that world isn't a healthy thing. And the convention recognizes that. It recognizes that the child, and it says to parents and to the state, help them, guide them, so that when they are given the full adult rights and freedoms, that they have confidence in handling and in analyzing and in weighing up what is good and bad in their world and what they want to subscribe to.
That's just wonderful to hear, and it would have been lovely for the committee to, our own cross-party committee, to have heard that last week, but hopefully some of them are watching today. Just before we move on, I want to go on to those experiences in Belfast and the different challenges there were to children's rights over the decades. But just before we do that, I want to return to one aspect of your studies that you mentioned before, and that's how that history of canon law has made us couple together rights and obligations. And I think it's something, before I heard you speak about that, it's something I hadn't realized the history of that, because I've lost count of the number of times I've told people what my job is, my passion about children's rights, and they've said to me, yes, but what I always say is, with rights come responsibilities. And primary schools in good faith very often have rights and responsibilities coupled together in their wall displays, etc. And of course, I say I'm a great fan of responsibilities. I think it's incumbent on us and as adults to help our children learn responsibilities as they grow older. However, it's really important children have the message that rights don't come on condition that they're responsible, and actually you have your rights on their own. And I say to children, and they look at me wide-eyed when I say this, even children who have done things naughty enough to go to prison, and that doesn't happen to very many children, luckily, they still have all those 42 rights that you've got.
They've those rights. And in fact, the convention doesn't talk about children's obligations at all. It talks about state party obligations, it talks about parental obligations, but not children's obligations. And that's important, I think, it's a very important marker of what the convention was about. The convention, after all, was a watershed. Here we were at towards the end of the 20th century. And we were now making a really very profound statement, having discussed civil rights and human rights from the Universal Declaration onwards after the mess of 2 appalling world wars. We were looking at human rights and individual rights, and we had moved conscientiously to seeing children as holders of rights in their own right. Now, that's a big, big shift, because I grew up, I'm the oldest of 9 kids, and I grew up in a home where you would have heard my mother and father say, for as long as you're under this roof, you'll do what we say. They stopped saying, I'm the oldest of 9, they stopped saying that after the 5th kid. They just gave up completely, and just said, oh, whatever you like yourselves. They got worn out with discipline, and people do change, and we have to allow ourselves the space to change. You've already mentioned there Corporal Punishment earlier, and it's one of the big areas where change has happened relatively quickly. We in Ireland, just a very short few years ago, just 5 years ago now maybe, we dismantled the last bit of that architecture I spoke about, that architecture that said that parents could use violence, physical violence, to discipline their children. It had already gone from the schools. We still had this common law defense of reasonable chastisement. And that said that parents who did use violence against their children or who smacked them, if it was reasonable in order to chastise or discipline them, then they had a defense. Now we've done away with that. So in other words, we now fully honor the child's right to bodily integrity set out in the convention. But let me just draw your attention to where that came from. We call it a common law defense. Where did it come from? It is straight from canon law. It's not only is it straight from canon law, it's actually straight from the book of Sirach. It's straight from, you won't find it in the New Testament, because thankfully in the New Testament, they never talked about beating children up. But in the Old Testament, they're never done talking about beating children up. And if you go to the Catholic Catechism today, here's 1.2 billion Catholics, 300 to 400 million children in a faith system that still tells them it's okay, more than okay, to beat your child. It's not even saying it's okay to beat your child. It says, the quote from the book of Sirach is, "He who loves his son will not spare the rod." Just think about that for a moment. It's not a case of, oh, well, if you get kind of really cross, it's okay if you hit them a smack, that's fine. It's saying that in order to truly express your love for your child, you must discipline them by the use of physical violence. And if you take that section, which is in the Catholic Catechism, and you put it back where it was in the book of Sirach, because it's only just one little extract, you put it straight back in the book of Sirach, and we're talking thousands of years now. It says, "Bow down his neck while he's young, beat his sides while he's still a child, lest he grow stubborn." I think I interpret stubbornness to mean have an opinion of his own. And that's where it comes from. So we're not just talking about a defense of reasonable chastisement in 2020. We're talking about this embedded structure built over generations and centuries, which told parents that in order to love their children, they had to discipline them by the use of physical violence. Now, so we have to engage with parents to say, you know what? That's thousands of years old. We don't do stuff anymore that's thousands of years old, because not everything that's thousands of years old is good or valuable or wonderful, or a great antique that's worth money. This thing was not a great antique. It was a thing that damaged people. Just ask yourself how you felt the day somebody smacked you or hit you. How did you feel? Did you feel big? Did you feel important? Or did you feel demeaned or demolished or diminished? And that's what you felt. So we've now learned, the social sciences that you're an expert in have taught us this. And we
made all those arguments, and we were so grateful that Ireland did that 5 years ago, because
thank goodness
for us and paved the way for us in Wales to pass our own law to remove that common law defence earlier this year, and we were so pleased. And one of the things I said was, Ireland's not so different from us, and they've done it, and they've found a way to do it, and I know we can do it here.
But there are many countries in the world, Sally,
still a long way to go, including over the border in England. Yeah,
it's still there. The common law, the empire carried it to the world. The Catholic Church carried it. The Protestant Church has carried it. Islam carries it. Judaism carried it. They embedded it. I remember visiting Lesotho a number of years ago and discovering to my horror that children there were children, incidentally, who maybe took 2 hours to get to school and had to swim across ravines to get there, would be routinely smacked if they arrived late. I mean, I can actually really, Wales has especially partnered with Lesotho, so there may well be people on this call today who have been to Lesotho, because we have lots of exchanges. And there's an opportunity for dialogue between us to say,
absolutely,
and not in a pompous way to say that we know everything, but rather to say, look, we've already lived that chapter. We've been through that, and we've come out the far end of it. And here's our view. We used to smack our kids. We don't do it anymore, because now we know that it gets in the way of them blossoming. It gets it doesn't make for a good, happy environment in a class. I mean, in primary school, we were smacked to death. I mean, no, not to death actually, but we were smacked
belted with a leather belt in Scotland.
Yeah, we were belted, and we had a batty headmistress, and she frightened the absolute living melt out of all of us. And I don't look back on those days, as my happy childhood school days. I look at my grandkids now, and they have a brilliant time at school. And my own daughters, I remember saying that over my dead body would I ever send any daughters of mine, to the Mercy nuns. And then by the time I had children, the Mercy nuns were complete teddy bears. And, and they were so good and kind to the children. And that's the lovely thing. Aren't we capable of change?
We are. And I'm an optimist, Mary. I'm a real glass half full person. I always like to feel we can move forward. And while we're talking about change, let's think a bit about some changes. I mean, in the early 1970s in Belfast, you became a campaigner for LGBT rights, which,
Well, that was popular then, you can imagine.
I was going to say, I was a child in rural Scotland at the time, and I know it wasn't a popular issue at all, and overt prejudice was absolutely rife. So, I think, and what you've done over the years is you've linked it not only to all human rights, but to children's rights as well. But some people might be thinking, what on earth do LGBT rights have to do with children's rights?
Oh, they're so important. Most young people, first of all, it's a human right. That's why I got involved. A colleague and I in Trinity College Dublin, David Norris, who's the best known gay rights campaigner in Ireland, he came to me. At that time, homosexual conduct was criminalised. And so gay men and women and gay teenagers lived in this dreadful half-light of fear and trepidation. They were the most excluded of people and felt the most excluded and frightened. And you can imagine, of course, many of them, coming from religious backgrounds, both whether it was Catholic faith or Protestant faith, whichever, they both had a very rigid view of homosexuality, which ran counter to the sciences that were evolving and helping to educate us. But why children? Because all the research, Sally, all the research breaks our hearts by telling us young people make the discovery, not the decision, but the discovery that they are gay around 13, 14 years of age. And they carry that inside themselves as a haunting secret. And of course, then it's no accident that over and against the society they live in, which has a very strange set of attitudes to who they think they might be as a person, as a gay person, you start to get serious problems with mental health, serious problems with anxiety, appalling problems with suicide ideation. And the bottom line then is, of course, that cohort of young people are overrepresented in the suicide statistics. That's not acceptable. It's not, and I've heard people just saying, oh, well, I mean, then that's all that proves is that gay people have, are fundamentally mentally ill people. And I say, no, hang on a wee minute now. You've just missed a whole chapter here, and that chapter is about your attitude and the attitude of people, the attitude of faith systems, the attitude of laws. These are deeply embedded. They shaped us, they molded us, they made us look at the world through these blinkers. And we had to remove those blinkers. And time after time, the most scholarly of research is directing our attention to childhood, particularly early adolescence, and in particular to schools. All the evidence that we have in Ireland shows us that our young LGBTIQ people are most at risk in second-level schools. That's where they're most at risk. And that bothers me greatly. Why? Because 60% of our schools are faith schools, and they cannot walk away from responsibility here, nor can we. I think the Irish people, in fairness to them, showed such a level of compassion and understanding of rights when, back in 2015, when we voted in favour of same-sex marriage and allowed that grace of goodness to flood the country and let so many young people, particularly young people, know that they weren't alone, that the public had spoken. 2/3 of the people who voted said they were 100% in favour of same-sex marriage. That began, I think, to cascade down into the thinking. But believe you me, it's not over. It's a battle that is far from over, because the stats on mental ill health and anxiety among young LGBTIQ people is just not acceptable. And it's much higher than in the heterosexual population.
Which brings me back to what we're trying to do in Wales, actually, and I'm going to pick your brains a bit now for some advice on this. So again, going back to our curriculum bill, which is going through, which I'm really pleased to say will mean all children will learn about their human rights in school. It will bring a universal education on that. It's also got lots of plans around what we're now going to call relationships and sexuality education.
Yes,
and which is a much more inclusive curriculum, which will talk about diverse family forms and emphasize relationships as much as a kind of physical aspects of sex, which again is important. And our government also plans to remove parents' rights to withdraw their children from that
That
education.
is so important. These are
Which I think is really
rights.
important part. I really hope it goes through. But there is some resistance to this from some people, some of whom from different faith communities, including Catholics, who think this is a job for the family. It's not a job for schools to do. Now, the government's working hard, I think, in Wales to engage different faith communities to ensure that they understand that this is about children's rights, it's about safety, it's about equality, it's about the right to information, etc. It's not a threat to them or their children. But you know, it's really important that we take people with us. I think the bill will go through because there are the votes in the Senedd. But what is important to me is that we take people with us. It doesn't become a point of disagreement or division in our community. And you've seen, as we've mentioned, quite a lot of legislation now go through Ireland that's really challenged social, moral, cultural and faith traditions. So what advice do you have for us in Wales, for the Welsh Government and for myself as Commissioner who supports this, and how we can bring this through but take people with us?
I think discussion is absolutely key, but also, and here's an important thing, listen to the children. They have a right to express themselves. They have a right to be talked to. If I learnt one thing from the last two referenda in Ireland, which were conducted very differently from past referenda, we had two, one on abortion recently, and we had one on same-sex marriage. And what was key to them and what was different this time was listening to the voices of people who would offer their experience. And I think that's very important, that we hear the voices of young adolescents and people who are post-adolescent as they explain what was either missing from the information that was given to them, what they would have needed to help them to grow and to blossom in the fullness of their own talents and in the fullness of their own confidence to become world citizens. You see, I understand where parents are coming from, and I understand in particular where strongly religious parents are coming from, but they also have to understand theirs is not the only voice here. The children have a voice. And the Committee on the Rights of the Convention on the Rights of the Child says plain and straight, they have a right to expression. And what does that mean? Well, it means we've got to just sit back and listen and create fora in which our young people can express themselves. And that sometimes means parents having to sit back and listen or invite the children to speak. Parents do not have the right to always speak on behalf of our children. It's an awful thing to have to accept, I know, but it happens to be the truth that our children will have their own views. And in a way, if they do, and if they are strong, that's a credit to us that we have raised children who can form a view and stand their ground. And even if they're wrong, engage them in dialogue and debate. I mean, we just cannot impose always our views on our children. And to make them safe in the world and to make them sound and solid world citizens, we have to help create the circumstances in which they have a free flow of information. They have access to that. They can weigh it. They can analyze it. They can think about it. They can talk about it openly. To be unable in your own home to talk about these things is not healthy. That's for example, young LGBTI people, you know?
Yeah, that's all really, really helpful. And I have to say, one of the greatest pleasures of my role as Children's Commissioner is that I have the chance to listen to thousands of children, young people.
And that's the essence of it.
I have never once had a young person say to me they want less sex education or that they want it to be on a narrower basis. But I have heard from hundreds, I would say it's accurate to say hundreds, face-to-face conversations or group conversations, that they would like a broader education on relationships and sexuality. And
absolutely.
Sally,
as I mentioned, I'm the oldest of 9 children. I was 18 when my mother had her final son, right in the middle of my A-levels, incidentally, most inconvenient. But she was 38 years of age. She had me when she was 20. when she was expecting that last child, and I was almost 18, going on 18. In fact, he was just born before my 18th birthday. And she had to take my sister and I, my sister's a year younger than me, and sit us down and tell us, do you see this bump that I have? We're going to have another baby in this house. That's how ignorant we were, Sally. Now, I know it's the last century and I know it's the last millennium, but it was unacceptable. And, and my parents didn't have the language because they just didn't have the kind of education that we're able now to engage with parents. There's so many support systems out there to help us trundle through this. Dealing with sex education I know it's scary. Most of us are mortified. I'd love to be able to say to my husband, that's yours, that's your business. And he'd love to be able to say to me, no, I think that's yours. But it is difficult. And yet there is so much more help today than there was back in the last millennium, when I was a teenager. And more importantly, there's more information about what happens and what vulnerabilities you create or you sustain if you don't engage in a realistic way with your children, that you're not preparing them. You're not preparing them for real life.
Yeah, and just your experience is one, of course, that sadly we've heard many times that people didn't have that information. And very sadly, that led, famously in the Catholic Church, but in many other institutions as well, to children not having the vocabulary to tell when they were sexually violated, actually. And
absolutely, and they didn't have
an important aspect of this.
That's exactly it. They didn't have that language. And also, I think if you go back to a culture of corporal punishment, where corporal punishment was the norm or was normative, they were used to adults crossing that line, the line that says, I'm entitled to full bodily integrity. Well, if you're a little child and adults routinely, whether it's in school or at home, smack you, beat you, how do you know where the limits are? Because you're
I agree.
Adults to teach you. And so we now know the dangers from how many reports do we need to tell us of the dangers of not creating clear lines and keeping people behind those lines in order to protect children.
That's also important. Now, Mary, I'm aware of the time and I know we're going to move on very soon to questions from the audience. And I haven't got on to talk about Brexit and I haven't got on to talk about COVID-19, but I'm hoping we may have questions about their impact on children's rights or their potential impact on children's rights. But I do want to take the privilege of being in my position here just now to ask you one last question before we go to questions from the audience. And really, I said at one point during the session that I'm an optimist. And my team always say, oh no, look what's happened now. And I always go, oh, I think it'll be all right. I think you have to be an optimist in my job. But I want to know, do you have hope for the current generation and future generations of children that we will keep on moving forward on children's rights? Or am I being absurdly linear? Do you think it's going to be a bit more up and down than that?
Well, I'm like you. I'm an optimist and I do have hope. But one of the things that life has taught me is that things are not linear. And unfortunately, we've seen this time and again that no sooner do we think that we have achieved something remarkable and wonderful and we're not going back we're not going back to those bad old days, then we fail to realize that the forces, the anti-forces are capable of regrouping, becoming stronger. And indeed, in fairness, while the digital age has offered us these wonderful open universal platforms in which you and I can have conversations and we can help to promote the rights of our children, there are also other people can use those platforms too and use them not to advance the rights of children, but rather to hold back those rights. I'm very conscious, for example, I taught a course on the Convention on the Rights of the Child at an American university about in 2015. And before I did, I went to a small town in mid-America, and I happened to just tootle into the Catholic Church there, and there was this huge big poster saying 10 reasons why America can't sign the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I looked at them and I took the 10 reasons, I actually took the poster and brought it to my class later in the university, and I said to them, take a look at that, and at the end of the course, you tell me how many of these are accurate. And at the end of the course, they all agreed that 9 of them were completely inaccurate and false. One, which was a factual statement about the convention, happened to be true. But so look, there are groups that are organizing constantly and to try and retain that old embedded architecture that says that children belong to their parents, and that they belong to their parents in perpetuity, and their parents can bring them up either with no religion, with agnosticism, with atheism, with Catholicism, with Protestantism, in Islam, and they can impose that upon them for the rest of their lives, and think that it's okay to do that, and not to honor the child's own rights when and as and when it grows towards and into adulthood, to make up its own mind about things. I mean, can you imagine if you were told as a parent, well, from now on, you're going to have to dress in blue. You can't do anything. You only ever blue because that's the rule. How would we feel if we were constrained in that kind of way? We don't, and in fact, COVID has taught us really something about living with restrictions and with constraints. Yeah. And how difficult that can be. I think what we need to do here really is, it's all, ultimately, it's about insisting that we constantly keep fighting and battling for the convention to be made real in children's lives. I mean, I hear complaints about the convention. I hear complaints about the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I accept, yes, it's not perfect. Dear Lord, it is better than anything we've had in the history of humankind, Sally. It's better than anything we've had in the history of humankind.
So we'll bank that and keep trying.
Think about that.
I agree, and we are both agreed we're optimists. And on that note, we should probably move back to Yuan and ask him to rejoin us to put to us some of the questions from the audience. I hope that was the right cue.
Let me see him. Unmuted now, yes, I think. Great. Diolch yn fawr iawn. It's been great to be part of this kind of lively discussion. Gwych. Can I just say, I love the conclusion, which is around banking optimism. Okay. So let me give you the approach of Gramsci here, where he talked about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I'm wondering whether or not that is the approach of the themes of today's question. So can I just bring some themes to you? You missed out Brexit, Sally. It's a good job you did, because actually that would certainly make us pessimistic. But can I just ask you this? At a time when international obligations are very much in view here in the United Kingdom, and the importance of maintaining our international obligations, what's the view of the luster of the convention in terms of the way in which the convention has been implemented generally across the international community where there has been a ratification of the convention? What does the tapestry look like? What does the texture look like of convention acceptability amongst the community of world nations?
Sorry, you want to answer that, Sally?
Okay, yes, great. Well, I'm lucky enough to be part of a network, an international network of children's commissioners and ombudspersons. There's one in Ireland, an ombudsman in Ireland, and in many nations around the world, particularly in touch with those around Europe. But that also includes, European nations with very different histories, including those that were part of the Eastern Bloc previously, and some of which are completely new nations as well, and new signatories to the UNCRC. And I suppose we share together ideas about where things are at and how well the UNCRC is being implemented. And it's obviously, as you might expect, very varied. And the UN committee, when it examines each nation, people like me give evidence, and we enable children to give evidence as well as to how the convention's being implemented, and the committee will ask different things of different nations, I think, depending on where they are in the journey. So for somewhere like the United Kingdom, where some of our implementation is more established than other nations, for example, our child protection systems, they will ask more of us in other ways than countries which are still really trying hard to get some of the absolute basic human rights there for children, like the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to basic health care. And I think that's right, that they should have more demanding expectations of the wealthier nations. But we are in different positions, and you know, as we've just been describing around corporal punishment, it's certainly not the case that, you know, Western Europe, for example, is doing this all beautifully and other nations are not. It is very varied, and Wales was, I think, something like the 58th nation around the world to remove the defence against corporal punishment. So that's really quite embarrassingly late, I would say, in terms of the tapestry. So it's not even, and some countries have done really well in legal protections, but they're still struggling to make sure that every child has enough food on their plate every day.
Yeah, I would agree. Can I agree with Sally and just make the point that when the convention was first promulgated, if you look at the early reports from the first countries to report, they were terribly tame affairs and very little engagement with civic society. The country, you know, wrote a nice, neat little document, submitted it, and it was the one from the first one from the Holy See is a classic example of that. It was terribly gentlemanly, may I say, discussion, and also probably not terribly useful. But now we've had this growth of a whole new industry of NGOs working in the field of childcare and child advocacy, everything from trafficking of children, prostitution of children, sale of children, children in armed forces from very early on in their lives, child poverty, lack of education. We've had a plethora of NGOs developing, and then, of course, organizations like that beginning to take a very active role both in their nations and not just in their nations, but in commenting on how their nation as a state party is representing its actions before the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And that's been a great bonus. But of course, the other big bonus has been the growth of people like Sally. We've had ombudsmen, we have commissioners for children, and the power they have and the authority and the reach they have, and most importantly, the profile they present of the child as a citizen who's entitled to have this level of advocacy, this level of contact and communication is absolutely important. I think for the future, for example, the new communication structure that has been introduced by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is a kind of a quasi-complaint structure or a quasi-complaints system. It's still only, I think there's only about 45 countries have signed up to it, but little by little it will grow. And we have to be, I think, patient, yes, but have the push, kind of with an impatient push, you remain patient that good stuff is happening. But there is a burgeoning of writing in this field, which didn't exist before. I mean, I'm gratified, for example, to see that develop.
I agree. And one thing that people might not know is that the last time the UK government was examined, Wales presented the views and opinions and experiences of the youngest children ever in the history of the committee.
Oh, well done.
That was done by actually Bangor and Swansea University's Observatory of Human Rights, their Little Voices project. And they enabled very young children, primary school children, to express some really important, profound views about their experiences and what should change.
I think that's the future, Sally. Let the children speak.
Great. Very, and clearly as well, I think is the point that you're making there, Mary, isn't it? And can I say how proud I am of that particular project in terms of Let the Children Speak and the work that was done in the law schools at Bangor and Swansea University, and a really important impact on research work, which has made a difference, and it's great to see that. One question that almost comes up as a theme And I'm not sure how to put this, but the context here, you made the point, Mary, around rights, and then you made the point about obligations of children being silent in the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. One question that's come up is this concept of, in canon law terms, a dolly in capax concept, and the issue here is the balance between the obligations of children and their capability in terms of their legal culpability, and whether the balance is right. We've had several questions, many from members of the law school here at Bangor, but around that question, whether it's on the basis of incarceration of children, and whether that is right, and how that actually feeds through into a criminal justice system.
Well, that's a big question you've asked there, isn't it? It's a huge one, and one where the debate has moved actually quite considerably right across, particularly the common law world. Most of us will have inherited the old canon law age of 7 as the age at which a child becomes capable of making up its own, becomes a moral person, essentially, capable of making moral judgments. And doli capax and doli in capax, that idea that you became capax, you became capable of making moral decisions, and most importantly, being held culpable, being held accountable for them. It started in canon law and still remains in canon law at age 7. So I don't know, I presume Wales at one time it was age 7, in Ireland it was age 7, in Britain it was, in England it was age 7, and then we started to move up. And in fairness to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it has helped us in this regard. Some very, very savage cases, dreadful cases, have also, unfortunately, whipped up, I think, public anger, public fear, public resentment. And so you get, instead of having what I might call a calm discussion around these things, there are unfortunate cases. You can think of the case, I don't need to rehearse them, the cases, of young children involved in really very serious crime that frighten the wits out of people. But in doing that, unfortunately, drive towards situations like for example, in Ireland, our age of criminal responsibility has gone up to 12 now. But for very, very serious offences, there is the possibility of being held accountable at the age of 10 or made amenable to the criminal courts. But what that shows me is that there is, we're engaged still in a kind of a dialogue about this and a discussion about it. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has, it originally said 12 to the member states, and now it has pushed that up even further. So juvenile justice and the issue of when children should be regarded as morally and criminally culpable is still something of an open question. Yeah. It's still in many jurisdictions.
Our practice has moved on in that, children who would have come into the criminal justice system are diverted now and supported to change their behaviour and to have other support in their lives. So we have thousands fewer children in Wales coming into the criminal justice system than we would have done. When even 5 years ago, when I became commissioner, there were usually over 30 children in incarceration, in custody, sentenced to custody at one time. The latest figures show 18 children, so that's a real drop just in 5 years. However, we haven't moved forward with the law on this. The age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales, and they're joined together because it's not devolved, is only 10. In Scotland, it was 8 until last year, but they've moved up to 12. And the Children's Commissioner there says that's only a starting point. It needs to be higher. If I am the English Commissioner, would dearly love it to be higher for England and Wales. If children are committing crimes or at that age, at a young age, then occasionally they may need a secure environment actually to keep them safe as well as other people safe. But what they need most of all is support to come to terms with whatever as they've gone through to make them behave the way they are and to move on and to recalibrate their lives. And that's the case whether they're 10 or whether they're 16 or 17 actually. I'm pleased to say in Wales there are plans to bring all children out of prison and into secure centres where in Wales, so instead of sending them over the border, where they will receive therapy, education and support if they're sentenced to custody. But it's a few years off before we'll actually see that in practice.
It's interesting, funnily enough, while I mentioned that canon law has done very, very little or nothing in relation to the convention itself, the new Code of Canon Law predated the convention, 1983, and it updated an old code from 1917. And one of the few, and there weren't that many innovations, one of the very few innovations in relation to children was canon law has a penal system, believe it or not. I mean, it can have courts and children can be made amenable to those courts. But it also said that children under the age of 16 could not be subject to a canonical penalty. And that was new. And I think that's interesting, that somewhere in the mix, somebody who understood where the social sciences and the judicial sciences were going was able to insert that into the new code. And that's always fascinated me as to how that came about, because as a document, it's not exactly what you'd call radical, but that was an innovation and an interesting one, and ahead of the posse, actually, as it happens.
Yeah, at 16, yes.
Yep.
Great. Moving on, this is a question from the head of the law school at Bangor. And this is an example to you of where we move from principle to specific issues. And this is a specific issue question where we can possibly test the convention or test our approach to the convention. The scenario is this: a 15-year-old in a school, a state school in Wales, decides that he or she does not want to attend collective worship in school, and this with the opposition of the child's parents. Under the law, the child's parents' rights would trump those of the child. Does that make sense in the context of a Welsh regime, putting aside now the question here of competency in terms of the devolved settlement, but in the context of a Welsh scheme where the rights of the child are must have due regard in terms of the way in which the approach of the legislative authorities and also perhaps the criminal and other authorities view the position.
Do
you want that one, Sally?
I'll start, but I'll get you to come in on that one as well, because I'm sure you'll have views. Yeah, the due is, I think, something that's really important about due regard and the measure that was brought in, that was mentioned right at the beginning of this session, is that we did move ahead in Wales in bringing children's rights into our law, in that ministers have to pay due regard to children's rights. And of course, that would include making rules about things like collective worship. But schools don't have to pay due regard. Local authorities don't have to pay due regard. Health boards don't have to pay due regard. We encourage them to do so, and many do so, but they don't have to in the law. So one of the things that I and my office are trying to get into the law is, currently on the curriculum law, we're trying to make it so that governing bodies, heads and local authorities have to pay due regard to children's rights, which would probably have implications for scenarios like the one we've just heard about. But also not just in the curriculum, but actually right across the piece. So Scotland are bringing in, hopefully before the May elections in Scotland and Wales, they're going to bring in a full incorporation of the UNCRC into domestic law, which I think is very exciting, but we're not there yet in Wales. Mary, I don't know if you want to go into the specific scenario on collective worship.
Yeah, I think this one is interesting, but well, the age 15 makes it easy, because I don't think any of our jurisdictions give the 15-year-old the right to withdraw without parental consent. And so, but then once you go past 15, the debate opens up. I mean, in England, sixth formers can make up their own minds, they can withdraw. Scotland has decided to wait until adulthood at 18 to give the young person the right. And again, honestly, I really do think here that we need to hear the voices of adolescents themselves. Over and against, there will be issues, obviously, particularly in faith schools, to do with how you manage people who withdraw. Where do they go? Who supervises them? All of those kinds of things, practical implications. And we haven't really had that full debate yet. But I think we are veering in that direction. I also think we are veering in the direction of a full blasted debate about compulsory religious worship, or like assemblies in school, and the correctness of that right across the sector. Including the state and secular sectors, and debate about whether or not there should be, whether or not religious education. We've already had the discussion about what's going on in Wales and about the impact of that, and how it's, the focus is on tolerance and diversity and understanding the world we live in. But there are, for example, there are situations, I think, today where young people, young adolescents, really are champing at the bit to be given responsibility in regard to these things. And I don't believe that we've really created the fora in which we listen to their voice and have their input properly into them. And the school is a classic one. In fairness to schools, we have seen the growth of school councils now that never existed in my day. And we do have greater scope, but it also worries me that that's inside a particular power structure where fullness of expression, freedom of expression, may be inhibited because of the relative power structure between teacher, head teacher, and student. Are you getting the full flow of what's really in their minds? Do we not need to have fora outside of the school, well outside of the school, where the young people can offer their views and have a say? Not necessarily be the deciders, but have a say in the process that leads to the decision. And these are debates that are on the way in all our jurisdictions.
Thank you. Sally mentioned that we're very excited in Wales because we are on the cusp of agreeing a new curriculum. And of course, the purpose of education is to turn mirrors into windows. And one of the key points here is, how do we deal in the new curriculum with what could be seen as extremist views, and how the extremist views find expression in terms of children, for example? I mean, particularly in the context of Black Lives Matters, issues around sustainability and what might hitherto have been seen as extremist actually within years become mainstream. And how do we deal with that kind of dilemma? And how do we deal with the fact that so often we don't see education as windows, but rather as mirrors of what we see ourselves as?
Great question. I have to say I have quite a lot of optimism about the content of, or the potential content of the new curriculum. Just in terms of that, there's going to be a strong emphasis on citizenship, on it, and all that comes with that in our values of citizenship in Wales, including equality. And just the example we've given already on religious studies, which will now be religion, values and ethics, will really help children to really start to explore some of those issues and to think critically about the views that they hear. And also, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, Joanne, and young people, the length and breadth of Wales responded really powerfully to the events, the global events this year, in relation to Black Lives Matter, and demanded change in Wales, not least in the curriculum. And, I am pretty encouraged that the Welsh Government immediately or quickly set up a panel led by the wonderful Professor Charlotte Williams, who to look at what you could call decolonizing our curriculum. And I don't think that was there yet in the new curriculum content that was there, but they have taken steps to do that, and they will be listening to young people's views as part of that. So I do have some hope, but I did say I was an optimist, didn't I, at the beginning? But it will be important, and we'll be careful that it will be important that children do learn about critical thinking, critical looking. We also have another opportunity in Wales. 16 and 17-year-olds will have the vote in the May elections and from all devolved elections therewith. And there's also an opportunity, because most 16, 17-year-olds are still in education, there's a real opportunity to enable young people to learn about critical thinking, about different viewpoints, about respect for others, about equality, and about actually what's not okay, what is hate crime, in fact, and which views are not acceptable.
Actually, I agree that I think that school might very well be for young people one of the few opportunities and few places where over a period of time their critical and analytical skills can be built up and need to be built up, because if you look at the access they will have to material coming at them, whether it's on television, whether it's on radio, or whether it's on the web, that is not filtered. And not necessarily filtered for them, but may very well be interested in seducing them, with ideas. Doesn't that really put a huge onus, therefore, on the education system to take very seriously its role, the role that it has over the years that it has those children in the classroom, to engage with them in such a way that they are growing in confidence in being able to analyze what they hear, what is given to them, whether it's indoctrination from the web, whether it is campaigns that just grow up almost overnight and gather a passion and a posse, and you're hoping that our young people will be able just to take a deep breath and say, let me just analyze it, let me figure this out for a moment. I mean, I think of some wonderful examples of young people who are leading great campaigns, very thoughtful and reflective campaigns, but also very effective. I think of Malala on education of young women. I think of Greta Thunberg in relation to climate change. There are great role models out there of young people. And again, I remember just a couple of years ago when I was in Italy one September, and there was a school protest. The schools came from all over Italy on a climate change protest, and the parents were there and the teachers were there, but they were there in support of the young people. And I thought that was a great partnership that gave just the feeling that here are people who are communicating with each other and who are using a kind of a collective power to empower young people to be their own voices, but to be sensible voices, to be intelligent, to be science-oriented, not to be carried away with ridiculous passions, or worse than that, to be carried away with biases and bigotries, because there are so many people out there who would love to hold them as champions and as soldiers of bigotry and bias, soldiers for bigotries and biases. But to have children who are able just for one moment to take a deep breath and say, actually, I know I've got to figure this out. Before I jump, I have to know what I'm jumping into. To be able to equip them with that ability is, well, you know what, it's a great vocation that schools have.
Well, can I first of all thank you for the dialogue and for the energy in the dialogue. I must also apologize to those who've asked questions, because we've come to the end of our time, but no doubt we can memorialize the questions, and insofar as we can, try and answer them a little later. But can I conclude really with some just concluding remarks before turning to the President of the Learning Society of Wales, Professor Howard Thomas, to offer a vote of thanks. Can I say, first of all, that we're all optimists in Wales because we've learned to love the rain. And I think that's...
Share that with your Irish cousins.
Good, well, that's right. We're all optimists together.
And the Scots.
in all of this. But can I say that that we have enjoyed the dialogue immensely, huge issues here. And it's really important that we engage not with pessimism of any intellect, but actually with optimism of will. And I think that's the approach to looking at the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. and particularly children's rights. Hillary Clinton, of course, put it that it's not what people say that matters, but what people hear. And what we hear in the context of the approach to the rights of the child are really, really important. What I'd like to conclude, because we're at the cusp of a US election now, is really to quote at the end the views of Eleanor Roosevelt, where she says, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." And actually, human rights, children's rights, shouldn't be dreams, but also should be part of the reality of the texture of human life, and particularly at a time of huge challenge as we have now. Diolch yn fawr iawn, diolch o galon I chi am eich cyfraniad eiraidd heddi, ac fe naw droiau at yr athro Hywel Thomas ar ran y gymdeithas I ddweud geiriau o ddiolch. Hywel.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Iwan. On behalf of the Learned Society of Wales, it's my great privilege and honour to propose this vote of thanks. Diolch ar ran y gymdeithas, mae'n anrhydedd ac yn bleser mewn I fi I weud cwbl o eiriau nawr at diwedd y sesiwn. The Learned Society of Wales is, as I'm sure many of you will know, our National Academy for Arts and Sciences. Our fellowship brings together experts from across all academic fields and beyond, and we use this collective knowledge to promote research, inspire learning, and provide independent policy advice. One of our key activities is the organisation of meetings on subjects of topical interest to us in Wales, and this event obviously falls very much into that category. It's therefore my very great pleasure to thank, first of all, Mary McAleese for today's discussion. Mary is one of the Society's honorary fellows, so it's with a special sense of gratitude that I want to thank you, Mary. The interest in this event has been enormous, and attendance one of the highest in our history for any one event. Diolch yn enfawr, Mary. Thank you enormously for taking your time to do this for us today. I also want to thank Sally, obviously. Those of us who know Sally will recognize the enthusiasm that she always brings. Thank you very much, Sally, today. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ofyn y cwestiynau ag am ateb y cwestiynau hefyd. Thank you very much for asking all the questions, the right questions, and also answering the questions. You're doing marvelous work, and you know, I'm sure that your contributions will be really needed in the coming years. So keep up the good work. Hoffwn hefyd diolch I Iwan, Is-Genedlaeth Iwan Davies, a phawb arall o Brifysgol Bangor sydd wedi gweithio mor galed I wneud I drefnu byddai heddi. Thank you very much, Iwan, and all your colleagues at Bangor University for hosting the event. We obviously regret we can't be with you in person and enjoy your hospitality, but it's really very good to be able to proceed along these lines. I want to thank the staff, my colleagues at the Learned Society of Wales, who put in a huge amount of effort to make this happen, and also very, very importantly, all of you, the audience that are here today. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ddod ag am wrando. I've been following the chat and the questions, and the feedback that I've seen has been extremely positive, and I do hope that those of you in the audience have enjoyed today. And last but not least, I would like just to mention very briefly my predecessor, Sir Emma Jones-Parry, who set the ball rolling in all of this. I don't know if Emma is out there listening to this broadcast, but if he is, just acknowledge very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Emma, am ddechrau'r daith yma. And with those words, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd. Thank you very much indeed. I can't say have a safe journey home because you're all at home already, but thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed today's meeting. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch fawr.
Noswaith dda.
Noswaith dda.
Diolch.